to what we've said, because of course you might have come hoping to hear something from WWF that we don't cover. So the piece of work that I mentioned is our Living Planet report. And if you've seen the newspapers and some of the sort of television news over the last couple of days, you might have seen something about this. It's a global report that WWF brings out every 2 years, and it's really, really important because it basically says how the world is doing, how the natural world is doing. And it's not normally good news. It comes out every 2 years, and every 2 years it kind of shows that we have damaged the natural world a bit more. But the report isn't just bringing bad news, it's also helping us to understand why that is and what we can do about it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So first of all, the Living Planet report is brought out by WWF, but we also work with some partners, and the main one is ZSL, which is the Zoological Society of London. It sounds like they're very, very UK based, but although they run some really big conservation centres in the UK, London Zoo being one of them, they also work all around the world. There's a network of scientists who are studying the natural world, wildlife populations all around the world. So they're really important partners. And they run something called the LPI, the Living Planet Index, which is what the Living Planet report is kind of talking through. So a few terms that I'm going to use today, and Anna might use some of these as well. So it's really important that we understand them. The first is biodiversity. And it sounds like a really technical scientific term, although I'm sure that many of you use it already. And it means all the different living things in one area. So you could be talking about the biodiversity of your garden, or you could be talking about the biodiversity of a country or of the whole world. But it's always it means all of the living things there and how varied they are. And then we'll also probably talk about ecosystems. And ecosystems is all of those living things, but also their environment. So the geography, the kind of landscape in which they live, and factors like the climate, and how living things interact with each other and with their environment. So it's about relationships between things as much as it is about what's actually there. And so you think about the jobs associated with these words. If you study biodiversity, you're a biologist, and that kind of means you understand how living things work, or you might know, for example, what a human body looks like inside and how it works. If you're an ecologist, you study ecosystems, you study the relationship between things, and you can understand kind of what's happening in a whole landscape that's good or bad for the different living things in it. So ecologists are very, very important to WWF's work because we need to understand what's happening in the natural world so that we can work out how to help it. And biodiversity is an important part of that because the more biodiversity there is in an ecosystem, the more resilient it is. If you think about it as having lots of different pieces of string joining lots of animals, plants, and different parts of the landscape. If you take one of those things out, it kind of breaks some of those connections because they're all connected in this ecosystem. If you have lots and lots and lots of them, then overall, if you take one thing out, the rest of the ecosystem, it just kind of manages. It doesn't change that much. If you've only got a few things, taking one of them out makes a really big difference and can break really important connections and to problems for everything in that ecosystem. So that's why we're talking about those key terms. And there's another really important distinction, because I'm going to tell you the main statistic from the Living Planet report, which is one of the big things that we talk about in news at the moment. The Living Planet report only came out yesterday, by the way, is species, which I'm sure you know means organisms that all share the same characteristics and genes. So we are all humans. We're from human species of that same species in one particular place. So when I talk about populations, I don't mean the global population of something, I mean a population. So for example, in this case, the wildebeest that are living in that particular landscape in the picture. So that will all make sense when I tell you how the Living Planet report works. So I mentioned the Living Planet Index, which is what ZSL, our partners, study. So this is just to get across what that actually is in practice. And it's studying our planet at the natural world level using lots of different techniques. So you can see around this diagram the various different things that are used to study the natural world. There's satellite imagery, so looking down from space and being able to see the signs of where wildlife populations are living. One fact for you is you can see where emperor penguin colonies, they're the biggest penguin in the Antarctic, you can see where their colonies are or have been because they leave big pink stains because that's the color of their poo. So there's things that you can look at from space that are really important ways of studying where wildlife is and how much of it there is. But there's a lot that's on the ground, a lot of it's out in landscape. Tagging lions and jaguars so that you can see where they go and where those where other jaguars meet and so on. Camera traps all around habitats, taking pictures when things pass by so you can see that they're there, and literally going out and just finding what's there with a pair of binoculars and a notepad. And scientists all around the world are studying what's going on in their local landscapes and feeding that into the Living Planet Index. And so they can see when one year there's a certain number of animals in a landscape, and then the next year if that's gone down or up, and that's in that population size. And that's what the LPI shows. And the stat from the Living Planet report this year is that on average, those populations that are being studied have shrunk by 69% since 1970. And we talk about 1970 simply because that's when we started gathering the data for the Living Planet Index. So if you imagine that your scout troop has shrunk by 69%, so that's half of them gone and then some extra ones gone as well. That's how much the population size has shrunk on average, and that's not representative of all populations. Some have gone up. So the fact that the average is this huge drop in size means that we have lost a lot of nature and a lot of wild from our world. And WWF and our partners are really focused on what we can do about this, because we know there's different paths. One path is that we just carry on as we are, causing these problems that are making wildlife populations shrink, and we continue to lose more and more of the natural world. It carries on declining. If we can just do lots of conservation work, maybe, and protect habitats, we might be able to keep things at this level. But we don't want things to be at this level because we have lost so much over the last 50 years that this is not a very healthy planet that we're living on. So we actually want to restore nature. So we call that bending the curve, that it's gone down, 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 down. We don't just want to stop it going down, we want to bring it back up and have more nature than we have today. And when we talk about biodiversity and when we talk about nature, it might seem like, well, that's nice. I love wildlife, or you might not, care that much about wildlife, although I bet most of you do. And actually, the big problem facing us right now is climate change. We hear a lot about climate change and how countries have to start, changing the way they do things so that they are burning less carbon and putting less carbon in the atmosphere to stop global temperatures getting warmer and all the problems that causes, like rising sea levels. And it's true, it's really important. But actually, when we talk about protecting nature, we are talking about the same thing. So climate change and biodiversity really, really linked. So this diagram just shows, as simply as possible, really, what I mean by that. So at the top, you've got all of those wonderful ecosystems. You've got the jungle, you've got the ocean, and stable. And so I've got forests and oceans there. If those forests and oceans become less healthy because we've taken away a lot of the wildlife or we've damaged it, they can't do as much to draw carbon down from the atmosphere. Therefore, climate change actually gets. So I'm sure you'll know the science is really important, because every tree in a huge forest photosynthesizing, it's drawing carbon out of the air and turning it into wood. and leaving some of it down in the soil. Smaller, or if they become less healthy, the trees aren't doing so well, and the soil isn't as good quality, then they just do that. People are less familiar with what but oceans are even more important than forests. More carbon taken out of the atmosphere and more oxygen put back in by oceans than we do from forests. And that's mainly because they're so big. But when you look at a big expanse of ocean, it just looks like in blue desert, like just a big expanse of water. But you've got to remember there's a lot going beneath the surface. When you look at that expanse of water, you're actually looking at a forest, because in the top few inches of water, where the sunlight is still bright and the water's a bit warmer, there are just every square inch of that millions of tiny, tiny organisms in, tiny, tiny little living things. And a lot of them are plants, photoplankton, we call them, so phytoplankton. And so if you think about a huge area of ocean, and all of that surface water being filled with tiny plants, and they're all doing what trees do, they're all taking carbon and releasing oxygen, then the oceans are doing a huge amount. And all of the other living things in the ocean help keep it going. So there's krill, there's tiny little creatures, tiny little animals that graze on the phytoplankton. And so they lock that carbon that's been taken out of the atmosphere and then turned into little plants. They lock that into their own bodies, and then they send it down to the bottom in their poo. In some cases, they get eaten by other bigger things, and then that eventually ends up on the ocean bottom as well. So everything gets locked in by the ocean. And that's a really important process if we want to help a stable climate. And it only happens if we've got all of that biodiversity, all of those different living things. And climate is affecting nature. It goes both ways. This is a flying fox bat, and it's just brought up as a rather sad example, just to remind us that climate change is bad for wildlife as well as bad for us. During a heat wave in Australia in 2018, about 23,000 flying fox bats died just over 2 days just from being too hot to function. They just dropped from the sky, dropped from the trees. And that just 2 days of high heat reduced the country's population by about a third. So, you know, as climate change makes extreme weather more frequent, that's going to make it harder for us to look after our natural world. So again, we need to look after those two problems at the same time. And so what the Living Planet report says, and I'm going to come back to it after Anna has told you a bit about one particular part of the natural. We look at the problems that we're currently facing and what's causing them, what's causing this decline in nature, and then we look at what we actually need to do about it. And so if you look on the left of this slide, it's talking about, you know, the problems that we have. We've got